What's good, and welcome back to part 3 of our Mythic Plus adventure. We are finally out of Murazon's Rise and ready to get back to the M Plus grind. Today's episode is an exciting one because it covers the final set of keys done during this weekly set of affixes, where we'll play some of the different rogue specs and tackle some higher level keys, as we inch closer to our goal of obtaining Mythic Plus title. So we kick things off on what I believe is a Sunday by running a few plus 18 keys as some different rogue specs. Now up to this point, you've seen me play Assassination, and that is my sort of main spec. It's the one I'm most comfortable on, it's the one I've played in Raid this tier and have played in M+, up to the point that I started recording and began this series. However, at this point in time, Assassination rogues came off something like a 15% Kingsbane nerf, and on the following reset, they were going to receive an additional 3% nerf. With Assassination rogues kind of getting gutted, I felt more incentivized to look at some of the other rogue specs. And to begin with, I wanted to send a couple keys as subtlety. Now, the keys themselves, being plus 18s, weren't all that exciting. Some different things happened, but for the most part, I and my group was kind of on cruise control and we just slammed through these places. So I'm not going to spend too much time specifically looking at the dungeon, but I do want to talk a little bit about the rogue specs. I will do some key pushing later in the video, so if you want to jump to that, I'll leave a timestamp below. But if you want to hear me talk a little bit about rogue, then stick around. So as far as being familiar with the spec, subtlety definitely comes second to Assassination. It's the spec I played mainly in M+ last season. I also raided as subtlety in Aberrus, the previous raid tier. And while the spec did get reworked, there are a lot of similarities between the two versions of subtlety, so that sort of helped to bridge the gap of knowledge. But on the other side of the coin, sub is also a lot different. In particular, it's very different with its damage profile. Sub went from being a damage spec that has consistent damage all the time to being extremely bursty, like one of the most cooldown based classes in the game. You will have what seems like infinite damage on some trash pulls, and then you'll go into the next trash pull and do less damage than the tank. At least that's what it feels like. And the spec is actually a lot of fun to play, but I feel like it would be kind of hard to play around, especially if I'm pugging into keys and pugging into higher keys, because I think to bring out the effectiveness of a sub rogue, you kind of need to pull around the rogue with big pulls every like 1.5 minutes or so, which in a pug setting is just not going to happen. Another issue with it is because of how bursty its damage profile is, there exist fights or moments in the Mythic Plus dungeon pool where you are almost useless and you have to lean heavily on the other DPS players in your party to do some kind of mechanic. A good example I think of is like the final boss in Everbloom. I know we haven't shown Everbloom as a dungeon yet in this series, but basically there's an ad that spawns every like 45 seconds or a minute or so, and as sub rogue, one of those ads you're gonna have literal dog water damage for. So it's a case of you have to lean on the other DPS players in your party to kind of fill the voids that your class brings. And that's not to suggest that you can't play sub rogue at high key levels, but at this point in time, that's my take on the spec. Now, one thing I do wrong playing this class is in multiple instances throughout both of these dungeons, I end up desyncing my Flagellation from my Shadow Blades. Flagellation has a 1.5 minute cooldown, Shadow Blades has a 2 minute cooldown, both of which are affected by the cooldown reduction that Vanish applies. But because they're desynced by 30 seconds, I would get in the habit of pressing Flagellation whenever it came off cooldown, which you don't really want to do. You lose a lot of damage if you don't sync up these two cooldowns, so despite Flagellation being a 1.5 minute cooldown, it's more like 2 minutes, minus however much you end up pressing Vanish in that time. I end up nearly topping damage in the Blackrock Hold, and then later I do top damage in the Galakrond's Fall. Not to suggest I'm just crazy good with the spec, I'm pretty sure I was a lot more geared than the players in here. I also had a lot higher of a Mythic Plus rating queuing into these 18 keys, but as hinted at before, this was my first time playing sub this season, so I'm sure there's a lot I could have done differently to have played the spec better. And then we move on to Outlaw. Now, I have never played this spec, but with its sudden emergence as a meta DPS spec, I wanted to give it a whirl and try to get some practice in. So I went through my bags, threw on any remaining verse pieces I had. Outlaw, by the way, gears a lot differently than Subtlety and Assassination. In particular, Mastery basically doesn't do anything for Outlaw, whereas it's a key stat for the other two rogue specs. so my gear definitely isn't up to par, but I still want to send a couple lower level keys just to kind of feel things out. And oh boy, was it rough. Outlaw feels like an entirely different class. I say this because it's the only one of the rogue specs that's proc based. You could maybe say that Subtlety now has some sort of proc gameplay, but it pales in comparison to the brain power you need to make snap decisions playing Outlaw on the fly. Everything in the class is proc based. It's not like you're pressing a whole lot of buttons, but the buttons you do press matter. And what makes this spec so challenging is that with each global, you're having to make a new decision. And not only that, but you're incentivized not to wait to make that decision because of the nature of how Adrenaline Rush works. Outlaw has a whole bunch of abilities that are affected by cooldown reduction, Adrenaline Rush being one of them, and if you play the spec optimally, Adrenaline Rush should essentially never fall off, because you're constantly cycling through abilities and refreshing its duration before your active Adrenaline Rush falls off, much like the Frost Mage Icy Veins gameplay. And as a result, the spec plays very fast. And as somebody that's never played the spec before, I don't have the muscle memory or the reaction timing or the right idea of what I need to track at any given moment down. So when I was trying to run this spec in Atal Dazar, which you're seeing now, it was taking my full brain power, try to play the spec to like 80% of its capacity. And that's while ignoring everything else in the dungeon. I wasn't kicking anything. I mean, I just didn't have the brain power to think about kicks or stops or setting up a focus target. There's just so many things to keep track of. And as a result, these key runs didn't go too well. The first run, my overall was egregiously low, and I ended up running back a second Atal Dazar to see if I could improve on that damage, which thankfully I was able to, but we are definitely underperforming playing this spec. It's going to take a lot more work if I expect to actually push as an Outlaw Rogue in Mythic Plus. Now, despite the learning curve, it felt good to get some lower level keys in, and especially some non-Murazan's Rise keys, but eventually I did want to look into some higher level keys to see if we could push our Mythic Plus rating, this time swapping back to my main and comfort spec in Assassination. So we queue into a plus 23 Dark Heart Thicket. My current best in that dungeon is a 22, so timing this would give me some score, and the first thing you need to know about this dungeon is that the trash at the beginning, specifically the bears, are very scary. Especially on a bolstering week, they have this kind of AoE roar type ability that deals more damage for each roar that goes off, combined with bolstering, leads to what you see on screen here. A big ass bear. So we end up wiping to the first pull, but we try to keep it going since the bear is almost dead and there are only a couple mobs left. But one of those mobs is a Nightclaw, which applies a bleed that doesn't get removed until healed to full. And the Nightclaw has like 5 stacks of bolstering and is just running around one-shotting people. Meanwhile, we do manage to keep the bear in combat, but its health resets back to full. And at this point, we end up just chain wiping to this pack of 4, and eventually the party lead calls GG, and that's key. So it's a quick run to kick things off, but luckily we queue right back into a new dungeon, this time being a plus 24 Galakron's Fall. My current best in this dungeon is a 2-chested plus 23, so timing this would be score. When I zone into the dungeon, we talk a little bit about the first pull, which is then followed by radio silence until the evoker types in party chat that they're discussing the route, at which point I asked if they were in comms just out of curiosity, and apparently they were, which was reassuring to know. Generally, I think players play better over voice comms because real-time communication can be had, which specifically can help make stop and kick assignments a lot easier to follow. They do end up extending an offer for me to join their call, but it's towards the end of my key night. I'm not really feeling up to it, so I politely decline. But then going into the run itself, the first bowl here is a lot of fun. There's a ton of trash mobs and you can usually get up to some pretty high DPS numbers. I start to ramp and approach 1 million DPS when my Kingsbane target, aka the Ripper, teleports out and spins around at a random location. This was unfortunate because at the peak of my Kingsbane, the splash damage affected no mobs, so this pull took a little bit longer, but we got it done, only suffering 1 casualty to a very bolstered mob. Whenever this guy teleports on, it's gonna get blasted. Yep. But aside from that one death, we take down the rest of the trash and the first boss without much issue. Which brings us to the trash before the second boss. Now the trash in this part of the dungeon is incredibly deadly. There are several mobs here that apply debuffs that will deal like 3 times your amount of health in damage over the course of their duration. A good example is this upcoming pull, where we have a dog and 2 moments. The dog will apply bloom to the main tank plus a random player. Now this ability can be dispelled, so usually the healer will dispel the non-tank target and the tank will just take that damage. But you see how much damage it does to me here, as it takes me from full health to proccing my cheat death over the course of 2 ticks. The moments will additionally apply their own debuff, which does a truckload of damage. So I set my cooldowns on this pack to ensure it dies as fast as possible, when then we butt pull the big mob in. Now I'm pretty sure this wasn't intended, at least it didn't look like it was intended, and to be fair, I could have distracted it to prevent it from running into our group, or at least buy us more time, but it ends up joining the party, and because it's bolstering weak, the big dude gets bigger, and this big dude also has its own debuff in the form of Chrono Burst. And because it's bolstering, this debuff is gonna hurt. So we end up kind of chain dying to this pack, but we do manage to get through it. We then work our way through the remaining trash, not without additional deaths, but nothing quite as significant as the previous pull, before then engaging the second boss. Now the second boss, Manifested Timeways, is a pretty simple fight. There are 2 abilities, one where it will spew out these balls. As a melee player, this ability is easy to dodge, just run counterclockwise around the boss. The second ability then is called Chrono Faded. 2 of your DPS players will be afflicted by this debuff, which, when dispelled, will spew out this sort of area of effect damage that radiates outwards. And where you're dispelled will determine how that circle spreads. So if you're dispelled in the light, it will be fast, and if you're dispelled in the dark, it will be slow. And the normal strategy for this fight is you want to dispel it in the fast section because it deals less damage than if you were to dispel it in the slow section. But the debuff itself lasts like 8 seconds, so realistically the healer is going to dispel one right away, and then the other will just expire on its own. And so it's largely a healer fight to have throughput for this debuff, to be able to top your party for the first debuff, which you then instantly dispel, and then top your party once more before the second debuff goes off. And of course, the rest of the players in the group need to manage their defenses accordingly. Now, one pretty cool thing you can do as a rogue is you can actually pre-cloak the application of this debuff, by which I mean you press Cloak of Shadows right before the debuff goes out, and if you're the person that gets chosen, you are then immune to the application of the debuff. And I do that successfully here, as we only get one debuff that goes on the Evoker. However, on the following set of debuffs, we're not able to top our party before the first dispel, and as a result, the non-dispelled player actually dies, causing their debuff to then also expire, and with both debuffs expiring at the same time, we end up losing both our healer and our shaman. Our shaman does have Onk, so he is able to get back up and continue DPSing the boss, but on the next set of debuffs, we don't have our healer up, so our Evoker goes down and our shaman goes down once more. Now, I managed to live thanks to my cheat death, and I actually have my 2-minute CDs come back up, so I'm able to get some last effort damage into the boss before the next set of debuffs, which I will surely not survive. And it's kind of funny here, I actually run into a ball because I'm trying to collect my little orbs from the trinket I use. I use a trinket called Witherbark Branch, and when used, it summons these 3 orbs that, when you run into them, give you mastery. So I commit to the Witherbark orb and just die for it. But we do deal enough damage so our tank's able to finish off the fight, at least take it the rest of the way. We then successfully pull off the dragon skip and make our way to the 3rd boss. Now, during the Blight of Galakron encounter, we do end up having 1 death during phase 2, and this is probably the most common way to die on this fight in a pug setting, which is when you pass the corrosion debuff to your tank too early. The corrosion debuff itself lasts 15 seconds, and it gets applied to a random player. That random player then wants to pass it to the tank because the dragon has a frontal that, when used on the tank, if they have the debuff, it will clear that debuff. So that's the goal, and that's what we're trying to achieve. But the problem is that when the debuff is first applied, the next frontal isn't going to happen for another like 20 seconds. So the first person that has the debuff needs to hold it for a period of time and then pass it off to the tank. If you pass it too early, the tank will then be forced to pass it back to somebody else, because otherwise, if they don't pass it, if the debuff expires, it will mind control that person. So in this case, when our healer gets the debuff, it gets passed to our tank too early, such that when the necrotic winds overlap happens, our tank is forced to pass it off to somebody else, so he ends up giving it to the shaman, but that transfer damage plus the necrotic winds is too much and he ends up going down. But aside from that one death, the rest of this fight goes smoothly, and we clear through one last trash pack before shrouding to the final boss. Iridacron is known for being a long fight. I mean, the boss has 850 million health, which is somewhat misleading because the encounter ends once the boss reaches 85% health, and Chromie will assist you during the encounter, occasionally giving you a haste buff. But since we engage the boss with about 5.5 minutes remaining, and it is a fortified week, we have enough time to finish the encounter, barring we avoid any major mistakes. Our shaman does get spiked during an Earth Surge, but we have battle res, are able to pick them back up and finish off the fight, timing the key and granting us 7 additional Mythic Plus rating. Now, while this wasn't the fastest Galakrond's fall I've ever done, and we definitely had several mistakes along the way, I really appreciated the level of coordination this group had when talking about the route at the beginning of the dungeon, and also the fact that all of them were already in Discord comms. I figured that if I can keep running with these guys, it would be a great opportunity to time some higher keys. So I asked if they wanted to run some more, but for a lot of them that was their last run as they were getting off for the night. However, the Demon Hunter did add my BattleNet in case they needed a DPS if they were to run in the future. And as it turns out, it was a good thing that I bothered to ask, because the very next day, the DH reached out and asked if I wanted to link up for a plus 22 Murazon's Rise. Now, while I was admittedly a little bit less thrilled of the choice in key, given my previous experiences in this dungeon, I was thrilled they asked me to run it back, and so I jumped at the chance to play again with them, in hopes that if I could make a good enough impression, perhaps they'd be interested enough to keep me around, and potentially we could work towards timing some higher level keys. And this is sort of like the other, less discussed side of doing Mythic Plus, which is like the networking side of things. Since I'm somebody that doesn't come from a retail background and I'm trying to wiggle my way into Mythic Plus title, I don't have a lot of connections. I don't know many skilled Mythic Plus players that aren't already in a team. So I'm in a situation where I need to take that step myself to try and reach out and form these connections. Because at the end of the day, Mythic Plus dungeons require a 5-man team. And if I hope to obtain title, trying to pug my way up will be very, very tedious. Not to suggest it's impossible, but I think it's well worth my time trying to make connections and meet skilled players in the hopes that perhaps something more foundational could form. Now, I don't know if this team will be that for me, but in my opinion, you gotta start somewhere. Now, as far as which people are running it back after yesterday's Galakrond's fall, 3 of the 4 same people are there, so they picked me up and plugged 1 DPS going into this Murazon's Rise. Which, and thankfully so, we end up making our way through without much issue, finishing the key about 5 minutes below the timer, and I do come out of it as top DPS. However, because of the plus 23 Murazons we timed last episode, this run doesn't give us any Mythic Plus rating, but after finishing this key, we decided to go into a plus 24 Waycrest that another one of the party members has. We last saw this dungeon as an untimed plus 23 back in episode 1. This time, of course, we're hoping for a different result. And the first half of the key goes quite well. We slam through the first 2 bosses when we start pulling the trash to the 3rd boss, Ral. Now this trash ends up causing us some problems because the Gorgers have a mechanic where they will leap to a random player, dealing large upfront damage and leaving a bleed. We end up killing a different trash mob that bolsters the Gorgers, and then the Gorgers start jumping around and assassinating people. We don't have the defenses or the stops to keep them contained, and so most of our party ends up chain running back to get through the pull. We then later butt pull the same trash pack that we did in episode 1, and again, I don't know how this pulled, but thankfully this time, we hadn't yet engaged the boss, so we were able to take care of the trash pack, but not without some casualties, as it was just me in the tank for a period of time while the rest of our party ran back. We then engaged Ral and immediately wiped. I think maybe the tank used some kind of ranged ability and didn't run to melee, thus causing the boss to use his party wipe mechanic. I don't know, but we run back, engage the boss again, this time more successfully, and we take down Ral. But now we're cutting the timer pretty close. Thankfully, the rest of the dungeon goes smoothly. We only have a few more deaths, 2 of which coming to some very bolstered trash mobs after the 4th boss, but we make it to the end of the dungeon, take down the final boss, and finish the key with just over a minute left. We do pull this off while topping damage, but it's admittedly less impressive if you take into consideration the fact that I just happened to die less than the other DPS in our party. But if you can look past that part, that's a dub, we take those. And on top of that, completing this key gets us plus 11 rating, pushing us over the 3100 mark. Now this was a pretty big milestone, and I was looking to keep this momentum going. So I asked if the team wants to run my plus 24 Dark Heart Thicket, and we agree to send it. For this key, we actually end up linking back up with the same group we had in the plus 24 Galakron's Fall. Then going into the first pull here, we actually don't pull the bear. And I mean, after our last experience in here, I think that's a totally reasonable choice. Our shaman does end up going down towards the end of the pull to a bolstered Nightclaw, but otherwise we clear through the rest of the trash in this first part of the dungeon without much issue. We then shred past the double pack of bears. You basically never play this. One bear on its own is already a lot to handle. We then move on to the first boss. Now this fight feels super awkward as a melee. The boss has both a frontal, a charge, and a leap, where the boss will leap to the furthest player from its location, and all these abilities can kill you as a melee player if you're standing in the wrong spot. Not to mention there are adds that leave this permanent ground stuff, where if you stand in it, will take you from 100 to 0 real quick. I don't really know how to position on this fight, and I end up getting leapt on as a result, which nearly kills me. But that's the worst thing that happens, and we end up cruising through this fight with no deaths. Now here we do a large pull. We take a Dryad, Keeper, and Blossom pack into a Dryad Double Blossom Patrol, and the way these mobs work is that the Keepers will heal the Blossoms every second for more healing than you can do in damage. So effectively you can't damage the Blossoms until the Keeper's dead. So the DPS priority here is to kill the Keepers first, and then the Dryads. The Dryads will just throw spears at random players, occasionally tossing out a poison spear, which obviously leaves a poison dot. And they're pretty annoying because they jump back, and it turns out that with 2 of them up, our shaman ends up getting gunned down, then later I get sniped, but the respawn's at the first boss, pretty close to where this trash pack is, so we run back, finish off the Dryads, and complete the trash pull. Then making our way to the trash before the second boss, we end up chaining a bunch of low health Blossoms into a pack of Nightmare Dwellers, and this is bad because they end up getting 4 stacks of bolstering, I get channeled on, don't use a stop, and end up going down. I did have Kidney and Cloak available here, I just didn't think to use it in time before I went down. We then take on Oakheart without much issue. We mow down some water elementals, moving into the third boss, where we again smash it out. We then have 1 death on the final trash pack of the dungeon. Our healer ends up going down to what I would guess is the Stalker's backstab type ability. The Stalker will occasionally teleport behind somebody and sort of ambush them, and with the 4 or 5 bolstering stacks it had at the time, it was enough to 100 to 0 our Resto Druid. So then we head into Xavius. One of these mechanics is called Nightmare Bolt. It deals upfront damage upon application and then leaves a circle where if there are no other players in the circle, it will silence you. So you have to stand with other players. This contrasts Xavius's other key ability called Growing Paranoia, where this time if anyone stands within the sort of red area on the ground, it will fear you for an extended period of time. It's not a big deal for the first phase of the fight, while the boss is still above 50% health, but once you enter phase 2 and swirlies start falling from the sky, it will more than likely lead to you running into a swirly. We take care of Xavius and finish the dungeon with a minute and a half to spare to time the plus 24, granting us an additional plus 18 Mythic plus score. And by timing this key, our keystone turned into a plus 25 Ataldazar. Now I realize I haven't talked about keys and keystones specifically. Players will acquire keys on a weekly basis, and you can level that key up, or if you don't time a dungeon, the keystone will then go down a level. So because we timed the plus 24 Darkheart Thicket, my keystone upgraded to a plus 25, and it randomly selected Ataldazar, which is a great key. Ataldazar is known for being one of the easier keys in the dungeon pool. I was stoked to roll into this, and we decided to go straight into it and send the 25. So off the bat, we head down the ramp and go to the left, doing a double pack with Lust. Now these trash mobs can be pretty scary. Both the Confessor and Augurs have multiple interrupts that need to be stopped, and the Juggernauts will charge the furthest player or thing from the group. Now here, since we're running a demo lock, it looks like the imps actually bait the Juggernauts charge so that the first set of charges just go on the pets themselves and don't hit anybody. But then later on, the second round of charges, we don't have anybody baiting out far, and so it goes in melee and ends up taking down our monk, then shaman, and then later our warlock. I don't think we were aware of it at the time, but there is some tech that monks can use to summon this like statue type thing, which can bait the charges and make that pull a whole lot easier. But after that, we clear a bit more trash and head into Razan. Razan is probably one of, if not the easiest boss fight in this current dungeon pool. So we take care of that and then head towards a Volkal. And this trash kind of sucks. We also have a couple deaths to it because it sucks. Most notably, these pulls consist of Witch Doctors that have multiple priority kicks, Shield Bearers, which will put up a barrier which reduces all damage taken unless the mobs are dragged out of it or the ability itself is stopped, and Reanimated Honor Guards, which are annoying because they take 0 damage until you kill the totem, after which point they'll begin spewing out this green stuff, which really hurts if you stand in it. So as a melee player, it can be a little bit tricky trying to maintain uptime while not standing in the green stuff. And then when you do connect with the mobs, the shield bearers will put up their shield and the damage you do is reduced anyways. And so then you'll use a global like blind or kidney shot to stop these shield bearers. And then the witch doctor will polymorph you. And there's just a bunch of things in this pack that as a melee DPS prevent me from doing damage. But we only end up having a couple deaths. I do die to a witch doctor cast. Again, I had kidney and cloak available here, so no excuses, should have stopped that. We then engage Volcal. This fight goes off without a hitch. It can be a little bit tricky in a pug, ensuring that all of the totems die at the same time. If they don't die at the same time, they'll heal back to full and this fight can take forever. But our group has the coordination and we take down this boss. We then make our way over to the priestess boss into the final pull that causes us issues. And much like the first pull of the dungeon, we still don't have a good way to deal with the juggernauts, so we end up losing players to that. We also lose our healer to what looks like fiery enchant. This ability can be stopped, but if you're too slow to stop it, you have to run out of the orange stuff on the ground. And then I stand on one of the blood pools because the priestess is using transfusion on me. When you do that, the priestess takes hella damage, but that dot hurts, and it procs my cheat death. Luckily, we are able to get healed through it, and we finish off this pack. We then take down the priestess boss and move on to the final boss of the instance, Yasma. Now, Yasma is a sizable step up in difficulty compared to basically everything else in here, because of how tricky and almost finicky avoiding the spiders can be. But our group smashes it, and we finish this dungeon with more than 3 minutes to spare. And this run also ends up being our first plus 25 key for the series, although I don't actually get score from this dungeon because prior to recording this series, I had actually already timed a plus 25 at all. But it still felt good to get the run down, and this key also marks our 5th successfully timed dungeon in a row. So our group is on an absolute roll right now. And while it is getting pretty late into the night, we decide to send one more run, and this time it's a plus 25 Blackrook hold. So I mentioned before that a Tall Desire is one of the easier keys in this dungeon pool. Well, if I had to compare it with any other dungeon, as far as difficulty is concerned, it would be pretty similar to Blackrook Hold, and Subcreation makes a similar assessment. This dungeon is known for having a very forgiving timer. You can be in a group with like 20 deaths and still time the key. And in our case, we're gonna need that, because our run doesn't go smoothly. And it's not like we wipe at several points throughout the dungeon, but rather, we pull quite safe, so a lot of single packs at a time, and then during these packs, we would consistently have 1 or 2 deaths. And over the course of the key, both the death penalty and the time spent running back from dying or having to get resurrected will add up. If I had to highlight any pivotal moments during the key, the first moment would be during the trash before the second boss. Now these packs are probably the most difficult packs in Blackrook Hold. This pack in particular, the archers, like the dryads in Darkheart Thicket, will target random players and shoot them with their bow. Add on bolstering to that, and both the shaman and I go down. And while the rest of our group manages to finish this pack off, the moment you finish it, a new pack of 5 will spawn in. And I think it automatically engages with you, or at least I haven't tried to run away and outrange it and see if that would maybe prevent our group from getting in combat. But whether or not that works, the 3 remaining members of our party end up engaging the next trash pack and have to then try and kite these mobs down the steps to meet up with the rest of our group. We do manage to recover decently well, but I unfortunately end up going down to an arrow barrage. Our healer soon falls, and like dominoes, the rest of our group goes down one by one, with only our tank alive to keep the pull going. Now, to the tank's credit, they do manage to stay alive, so we're able to finish the mobs off once we get back, but the whole process of working through these 2 packs has taken us about 4 minutes, when, if done cleanly, probably would have taken 1.5 minutes, maybe 2 minutes. The next key moment then comes during the final boss. We engage Kurtalos with 4 minutes remaining. Now here we have enough time to finish the key, barring we can pull off this fight cleanly. I set my 2-minute cooldowns here because while this boss himself doesn't have particularly deadly mechanics, the other boss that's raining down shadow bolts on the raid, those hurt kinda bad, so the quicker you can kill this guy, the safer things generally are. Then when the demon spawns in, the first shadow bolt volley that goes off hits very hard, and it's crucial that everyone in the party uses their strongest defensives or leans on externals to keep them alive. I have Cloak of Shadows, so I'm fine, but unfortunately our Evoker ends up going down here. Now we do have 2 battle reses, so we expend 1 here and are able to get them back up. Once the first Shadow Bolt volley's gone out, the rest of them are a little bit less intimidating because now we have a massive health buff. So after that first Shadow Bolt volley, we're kind of chilling. The only mechanic that can possibly cause issues is Stinging Swarm. And here our Shaman actually gets targeted with it. I am in my 2-minute cooldowns, doing a ton of splash damage to this ad, but our Shaman flops. I don't know if it was a case that they didn't use defensives or maybe they just weren't healed fast enough, but they died very quick. So we had to send our second and final battle res to get them back up. Then I get picked on the next Stinging Swarm, and as a rogue playing cheat death, I don't really have any tools in my kit I can use to survive this well. I press health pot. I did have Crimson Vial available that I didn't press, although I don't think it would have saved me. Unfortunately, because I go down and we don't have another battle res, the rest of the group has to 4-man the rest of the fight, and while they do manage to pull it off, the boss goes down 30 seconds after the timer. And thus, we just missed timing this key, which, while admittedly a bummer, I was definitely stoked to have timed as many keys as we had. And with that key, our team ends up calling it a night. Now, because this was the final batch of keys before the weekly reset, I did pack in quite a bit more, and hence this episode's a bit longer. If you stuck it out to this point, let me know if you enjoyed it, if you felt like it was too long, too short. I'm pretty open to the idea of how I can differently structure these videos. Do we want kind of more in-depth explanations on things? Do we just want to cover the highlights and lowlights of these keys? Let me know. But next episode, for sure, tune in for the weekly reset. We'll be tackling a new set of affixes. I'll talk a little bit more about how affixes work, and we'll also get to pick up some new gear from the vault, and if we're lucky, maybe pick up a couple pieces from Mythic Raid. But that's it for this one. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next episode.